Well, thanks all for coming. One of the things, I gave this full day presentation in New York about a month ago, and I opened up the presentation. They were giving it to like 400 people around about shared living. And when I was sitting down in preparation for that conference, I was sort of thinking about what the goals that I wanted to achieve to a state that really had no idea what shared living was. And although I began to sort of go over my mind what those goals might be, something sort of jumped out in front of me, and what jumped out in front of me was a conversation that I had with my son Grayson a week previously. And he had just finished finals. He's a student at the University of Massachusetts, and they, like most colleges or universities, they have these bulletin boards where people can post sort of things. And ironic, irony for 18, 19, 20-year-olds is such a big thing, and funny things. And he wanted to show me this thing on the bulletin board that had gone viral. And at the end of each semester, students are asked to write an evaluation of their semester. And somebody had written an evaluation, taken a picture of it, and then posted it on the bulletin board. And you could actually see the student's handwriting. And the evaluation, and what he read was that if I had 1 hour left to live on this earth, then I'd spend it in this class, because it felt like an eternity. Well, my goal here is to make the next hour not feel like an eternity to you.
That's awesome.
Anyway, so that's my number one goal. Several other goals, which are sort of more pertinent to shared living, is that I really want, I think the first and the foremost is to have you really get a sense that the values behind shared living, that there are other organizations, there are other people that do shared living, but I believe that it's really unique the way that Nonotuck does it, and it's based on what the values that were created well over 25 years ago that have now been instilled within the organization and remain what they were 25 years ago. So underscore the importance of the values. I also want to sort of underscore the total full commitment to those values and to the belief in shared living, that we can only provide the best of services if we believe in the models that we've created, as well as the values that we believe in. And so that said, I want to, in keeping in my own mind about the whole sort of thing about eternity here, I'm going to begin with sort of the history of Nonotuck. The organization was incorporated, this is 40 years ago, almost to the day. It was incorporated in December of 1972. We're actually now on our 43rd year, given that it's 2013. And it was created by a group of parents whose children at that time were at the local state school, Belchertown State School, and all the parents there had been, as many of the parents at that time, who talked to their physicians and their family doctors, etc. It was basically a recommendation from their doctors and sort of the community and the culture that the best people who had disabilities were best served in larger institutions. And so these 3 or 4 parents whose children were age 5, 6, 7, 8, around that age, were at Belchertown State School, and they didn't like that. They didn't think that that was the best way that their kids should live. And so they banded together and beat this sort of path between this area, Northampton and East Hampton, to Boston and the State House, worked very closely with their local legislators, as well as others, to wedge some money out to create, which in 1972 is the first group home, it actually wasn't a group home, congregate living for children with what was then sort of called mental retardation, now intellectual disabilities. But So they created this home, not without any struggles, because once they were sort of awarded this money to create this home, and it was a sort of this, based on this parental model where this husband and wife lived with these 4 children with disabilities. So it was a live-in sort of model, not we've almost gone full circle in some respects. But they also had to fight the local community. East Hampton at that time wasn't really in tune with wanting these different people to live in their community. And there's so many, you go back and you read some of the press clippings back then, there's so many sort of people that really stepped forward. This woman stepped forward and brought her church to this sort of select board meeting, which was going to have the zone, allow the zoning for people to live in East Hampton, and there were struggles there, but the community really won on this one and really endorsed and supported this creation of this wonderful place for these mothers, the organizing mothers, the founding mothers of this organization, and their children to live. So the agency it was in sort of this purity about it in 1972. Again, 4 people living in this beautiful Victorian house in East Hampton, sort of house parents living there all the time. There was an incredible support from the families. There was a board of directors that oversaw the organization. There was a volunteer board of some of the most influential and powerful people within this area. People from representatives were part of the board. Church people were part of it. Local businessmen and women were part of this board. An incredible sort of model of way to really provide services, where it was really a community-based means and ways to provide services to people and oversee those services. Well, as institutionalization began to grow in the early 70s, although back then the model more often than not was let's rehab the institution so to make people's lives better in the institution, there was some deinstitutionalization going on. And as that began to happen, then the organization began to grow a little bit more. There was another house that was built in Amherst, another one in Northampton. Then they began, and it was sort of the downfall of that purity. An executive director was hired, and the agency continued to grow, as did the community-based services that surrounded it. In 1980, I had been this is sort of my story, and my story will eventually converge with the agency story. I began, after years of sort of trying to find work that I could believe in a field that I could really believe in, that I felt that met my values. I was sort of somewhat of a child of the 60s whose values were grown and based on the civil rights movements and the anti-war movements, civil rights movements for minorities as well as women. And it was a struggle for me in the 70s to find some sort of niche that I could continue to do that. And then I got a job at the local institutions, the Northampton State Hospital. I was awarded a 1-year grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to work with the law office, but then it's now called the Center of Public Representation, which was the law office that sued the state to close the Northampton State Hospital. So I worked in that law office. The suit, it was a consent decree in the late 70s. It was a sort of an agreement between what they called the plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs were people that were currently in Northampton State Hospital, as well as people that were in danger of going into the Northampton State Hospital. And then the Governor Dukakis, overseen by a federal court. And the federal court, and the agreement was that the Northampton State Hospital would eventually close, and all the people that were going to live there or were living there would be moved out into what the federal court determined would be an emerging community-based system. community-based system based on three different things. One was a residential, a second was sort of what's going to happen to people's day, and the third, what is the emergency service system going to look like. So anyway, my responsibilities was to go onto the wards of the state hospital and immediately begin to work with people that were in the state hospital, and my job was to get them out of the state hospital, to represent them legally in ISP meetings and other means. Really struggle very much and very deeply with the psychiatrists and the clinicians who really, it was their aim seemingly to keep people institutionalized while the legal system was trying to get people out. Meanwhile, it was very interesting. Most of the people here were at the last leadership development meeting with the two Michaels. And I don't know if we talked about this, but at the luncheon between Michael Maloney, Michael Lundquist, and I, we were talking about how we got sort of really hooked into what we do. And it's really interesting. The three of us all went to the first day we ever walked into an institution or something that happened in an institution. And Michael Maloney remembers this time that he worked in what he was at Fernald, which is in the other part of the state. He walked into, and he was a direct care worker. He was, in his early 20s, and he was working in what they call the snake pit at Fernald. And he remembers as clear as what happened yesterday that he was alone. There were probably about 60 people in this part of the institution. Many of the people were naked. People acting like they'd been in the institution for a long time. And he was totally overwhelmed at this moment. And he saw this man, and this man was just sitting. And so he went over to that man, sat down next to him, and just started combing this guy's hair. And he said the hook came, and that guy looked at him with this love and this compassion that he had never seen before. The guy just, and he said, from that day on, I knew what I was going to do. Michael Lundquist, and I think you heard this story, talked about the day that he was in the institution, and an old friend of his was there also. He was also in the snake pit, and there was, at that time, teams of films and political people were going around, and this guy saw, Bresnahan was the man's name. He was working again in Belchertown State Schools, also a snake pit. And the administrator of Belchertown State School sort of walked towards the door with his film crew from Hartford and moved past it. And this Bresnahan ran out the door, paused for a second, ran out the door, brought the people back in to film this snake pit, and was a moment in time which may have been sort of almost an agentry of change, where once that film was disclosed, that people began thinking more deeply about how we treat people in institutions. And I can remember like it was yesterday, thinking of and remembering the first day I was on the wards, in the back wards of the Northampton State Hospital, and thinking that here, after all these years of thinking about people that were marginalized, that I'd never ever given any thought to people that happened to have some sort of physical, mental disability, and how oppressed, beyond oppressed that I thought that people could be in 1980. That people were locked up, not because they did anything, but because they had a potential of doing something and they happened to have a mental illness. That people could be locked away for years just because of the potential. You and I can have the potential to do something dangerous to others or ourselves and never be locked up for that potential. But if we have a mental illness, then we can be. So it was there that I also, that day, to see the conditions and the smells and the sounds, and Michael and I just remember so clearly that picture and those feelings of those senses that will never go away. That all three of us, it's very interesting, decided that we knew what we were going to do for basically the rest of our lives. So I worked for a year at the state hospital. The grant ended, and I got a job in that emerging community-based system. I came on and became a program director of this agency that was providing services to people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness in creating community-based sort of staff apartments or group homes. And it was very clear to me right away that although I had been helping people move out of the institution in these situations, that these group homes are better than the institution. There was still so much inauthenticity about the way people lived. You don't really have to get into it, but the idea that people really had no choice about where they were going to live, who they were going to live with, who was going to work with them, who was going to be with them, people coming in and out of their lives. It just didn't make any sense to me. Plus, the community resistance was just so hostile, and we were adding to the stigmas of people. We'd go into communities and say, people should live next to you, and we were sort of trying to jam these things down on communities who really. And then it became not about, everybody looked so horrible in those situations. Communities looked terrible for not being willing to accept people with disabilities. People with disabilities looked worse because people had to sort of increase what their stigmas were and make people look worse than of course they weren't. So I began sort of this quest of looking at possible ways alternative ways that we might be able to provide services to people. And I ended up in this L'Arche community in Syracuse. L'Arche is a movement. It's an international movement that was created by this man named Jean Vanier in the mid-60s. Jean Vanier is one of the great men in this world. And he, in the mid-60s, lived in a small village of France and asked, and in that village there was an institution. He was invited to the institution and he met a couple of people, and he eventually asked those people to live with him. So those two men left the institution and lived with Jean Vanier. And I'll show you at some point. You'll have to see the film because we asked Jean Vanier for years to come over and give the lead address at the Shared Living Conference, and every year he would politely refuse. And so finally, Nonotuck sent Bob Hannon, who's now on the board, over with a filmmaker to France to interview Jean Vanier, and the interview is incredible. And he talks about those days, and what he talks about is how they didn't, this is a quote, we didn't eat very well because he did all the cooking, and they had an outhouse in the back, and where his mistakes were is that he really thought an awful lot about who the people were that he invited in, but he really didn't think much about the community. And it being the 60s, that people were drawn to this style of life, people, and so more and more of these things began popping up around the village, and it became overwhelming. And then he sort of figured that out, but he talks in epic ways about who people are, the way he has visions of people, about what people's internal being is, and drawing out sort of the internal things in people. And he never hesitates about talking about what love does for people, what love does for him. He never hesitates and talks about what he gets from the relationship, which is so important in relationships. And so this movement spread out in the 60s in France, and then in other parts of Europe, spilled over into North Africa, eventually came over to North America, in Canada, and then L'Arche community opened up in Syracuse, and in 1981 I spent some time in L'Arche and was blown away. And I was blown away by seeing what relationships were created by people who had willingly decided that they wanted to live with each other. Now, L'Arche is based on many religious principles. And so people have to sort of take these vows of poverty to be part of it. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to take sort of the secular things that came out of this L'Arche community and to bring it back into Western Massachusetts. And those things that I saw, there was an incredible mutuality of love between people. And you could see what that love had done for people with disabilities, how valued they were, how sort of, lack of a better word, normalized people were, how more authentic their lives were, where there was an equity in the relationships, there was an equity in the power within the household, where people without the disabilities weren't more sort of powerful or didn't have control over people's lives that happened to have the disability. I saw that because there was no sort of unauthentic interference led, that the communities around where L'Arche was unbelievably involved in the lives of people. Communities surrounded and embraced the L'Arche communities because they weren't pushed away from it. There was this incredible network of what we called citizen advocates that were involved. It was just an experience that I saw that there was that mutuality of respect and love and an interdependence between people. So I came back after this with all these sorts of ideas back into the agency and decided that I was going to work to see whether or not I could help create what I envisioned, which was what I called life sharing. And life sharing, which began to emerge in my mind as this relationship that was based on a mutuality of love. If you think of your own closest relationships, those relationships are based on a mutuality of love. There's a mutuality of respect between people. And there's an interdependence between people. Those people that we're closest to are the people we're most dependent upon. We have a dependence on those people. In typical disabled, non-disabled relationships, what we find is that the disabled person is dependent on the non-disabled person, but it doesn't go both ways. But in L'Arche and in what I see as life sharing, it does. And finally, there's no financial sort of profit to that relationship. So I envisioned, well, maybe we can do this out here. And so we worked, a friend of mine and I worked very hard, and we created this pretty incredible life-sharing circumstance with this woman named Barbara. Now, Barbara was a woman that was not easy to live with. She had this diagnosis that I've heard once in the last 30 plus years that I've worked in this field. I've never heard it again. It was called profound ambivalence. And this woman was so ambivalent about things that she would literally get stuck in doorways because she didn't know whether or not she wanted to enter a room or leave the room. And so she couldn't make up her mind about anything. I mean, as simple as that, she couldn't make up her mind. And if you can think about, there's been times when you've been close to somebody and they can't make up their mind about something and it's driving you crazy. And as much input you may give in to help with that person with that decision, they cannot make up their mind. Well, this was everything in their lives. In Barbara's life, she didn't know what to eat. She didn't want to know what to eat, what to wear, where to go, what to do. You know, it was just very, very difficult on people. You would see her, and she would get stuck. I mean, I say in doorways, but she would make her way downtown Northampton and sort of get stuck in Main Street in Northampton. It was like a magnet. There'd be one person there, then there'd be two, then there'd be four, and then there'd be five. And then a cop would come along, and the cop would get stuck with her. But anyway, the point being that this was not an easy person to live with, but we found people that wanted to live with us, and they lived on Harrison Avenue, which is a street off of Elm Street. It's right above Smith College. It's a beautiful, beautiful street, old historic street, and a beautiful apartment. And I hadn't seen this. Amy Gleason, you remember Amy Gleason. She was one of the life-sharing people. I hadn't seen Amy Gleason in about 30 years, except for probably 25 years. Anyway, I hadn't seen her in 25 years, and I just bumped into her a week after I told the story. And I hadn't told the story in about 10 years. And it was amazing that we talked about Barbara, and Barbara moved on. She was an amazing woman who became, sort of had this breakdown because she was sort of the stability in her family's life, and that fell apart, and so did she. But the idea was that we got it done, and we got it done in 1984, but there was no support within sort of this, this forward-thinking, progressive organization, nonprofit organization that, we'll let George and his friends do what he wants, and then, humor us, and then, but not really take any investment on it, because they were into sort of building more and more staffed apartments and group homes. So while that was going on, there was a similar, sort of a different situation that was going on. And the point being here is not only did the progressive sort of agencies not want to do any of this, the government, DDS, who was part of DMR at that time, DMH at that time, was not interested in this also. It was this group home that a friend of mine was sort of the head of this group home, and he was an amazing manager because what he had done is he had incorporated the lives of the people that lived here. There was 4 or 5 men that lived in his home into the lives of the community. My friend had so many relationships in Northampton that he just brought those relationships into this group home. And people then had relationships with these 4 men that lived there. So this agency that oversaw this group home was going bankrupt, and the state was going to take over all their group homes. And one of the things they were going to do is they were going to consolidate the group homes and split up these 4 guys who had lived together forever and ever and ever and didn't want to be split up. So the manager and my friend, the manager, and I put together this sort of these commitment, basically, letters of about 35 to 40 people who agreed at no pay to volunteer to live and work with these 4 guys for 1 year, and while they all sorted it out. And so we brought these commitment letters, we brought this idea to the DDS, and we were told in very uncreative ways that couldn't happen. So the point again being that there was no sort of cultural support for what some of these, I thought were pretty sensible, but other people thought outrageously radical ideas for serving people in different ways. They just kept plowing ahead with this vision of group homes. In 1987, I applied for this position here at this organization and was hired, and almost immediately began to talk to people we provided services to, as well as the board, first of all the board, people we provided services to, and their families, about a different way that we might provide a service. And as we began talking more and more about it, the vision of life sharing, which is those 4 ideals of the love and the respect and the interdependence without financial profit, was then sort of consolidated into more of the secular idea of, well, maybe we can do the first 3. Maybe there's that our goal would always be life sharing, but maybe there was something in between to prepare people for life sharing. That the leap between the group home and life sharing would just be too wide. That chasm would be, the inability to bridge that chasm, I think, would make it impossible. But if there was something in between, maybe something like, we call it supportive living there, but really it ended up being shared living, where you could get the first 3 you could really try to find the first 3, but in some ways, we would pay people, we try to pay people in ways that would still in some ways compromise the relationship, but would also place a heavy expectation and burden on the way that people ought to live with people. So we began to really think about what that interim step would be, and it was shared living. We began talking and talking and talking. And we began, and then, interestingly enough, in the late 80s, there was a Republican governor who was looking at ways to serve people or to cut costs, and he got this report out of Minnesota where there was no group homes. They were all people living with people in sort of family situations. And there was obviously a real service benefit for it, but definitely there was a cost benefit for it. So the Moscovich report, which was that report, sort of opened the door to shared living a little bit. And the governor, Weld administration opened that door, and we were positioned like nobody else, and we blasted through that door. And in 1991, we began systematically closing 15 group homes and moved over 50 people into shared living circumstances throughout Western Mass. It wasn't an easy task. It took, at times, I met with every single family member. Sometimes it only took once to convince people that this was the best way to go. I met with certain family members 20 to 30 times. The current president of our board was Fred Bona, and Fred and his wife, incredible wife Dale, and their love for their daughter Carrie, extraordinary. And they were so sort of politically in tune that they were able in the mid-'80s to late '80s work with then State Representative Jane Swift, who soon afterwards became the governor of Massachusetts, to create this beautiful house in Lennoxdale, Mass. And it was a group home. They rehabbed this house. It did such a beautiful job with it. So their daughter Carrie moved into this house with 3 other women, and they were so essential and so critical to the development of that house. I didn't want to let that house go. But I kept working on them, I kept working on them. They wouldn't listen to me, they wouldn't listen to me. Until I had them meet the mother of Jack Zuchik. And Jack, we had been serving since the early 90s. He lived in this house in Greenfield called Scout Road. And this was an older Polish woman.
His grandmother was working there in Scout Road.
Yeah, that's right. So she was this old Polish mother who just had incredible love for Jack. And Jack would come home on weekends, and for some reason she believed me. She believed in what I talked about. She believed in the idea of shared living. And we moved Jack into an apartment with Bob Burley, and Jack just unbelievably flourished. I mean, he had never talked to his mother before. He began talking to his mother. He began sort of formulating new sentences. There was all this sort of relationship development that went on that was just incredible. And the mother, Jack's mom, was so incredibly appreciative of what had happened for Jack that I had the bonus meet with Mrs. Zuchik. And Mrs. Zuchik convinced the bonus that this was the best thing for Carrie. So in some cases it was, one time, and in other cases it took a year, maybe even more, to convince people. And of all the people that were in group homes, of all over 50 people in group homes, there was only one person that didn't go, that decided, the guardian decided that that person shouldn't go into a group home. It's too bad because we had the perfect provider for him too. But anyway, so we were rushing through the door, and DDS was beginning to sort of freak out here. They're going, wait, what's going on here? I mean, we said we could do this, but all of a sudden group homes are closing, people are moving, and their head was spinning. And we were the people that were on this were in it, full bore. And so I said, okay, this is what I'll do, is that I'll set up a meeting for all the family members of the people who have moved into shared living. We were about halfway, 3/4 of the way into closing all the group homes. And you can talk, this was the regional director of DDS, you can talk to the family members, and you can talk to the people who have also moved into shared living. And you can ask them questions. I said, you know as well as I that I have no control, you have no control of the family members. They're going to tell you exactly what they feel about this. So the regional director, a bunch of the area directors, and then the assistant commissioner of DDS, Jerry Morrissey, who soon after became the commissioner of DDS, met at Cooley Dickinson Hospital with, at that time I think we had moved 35, almost 40 families, and 35 of those 40 families were represented at this meeting. And they went around one by one and talked about, do not even think about moving my kid back into a group home. I mean, it would be like moving people back into an institution, one by one by one. And the final person was this mother of this woman we provided services to, and she absolutely broke down, and she started crying. She said, my daughter, who at that time was 40 years old, had never hugged me. She moved into shared living, and within 2 months, the first time that I ever hugged my daughter. And so at the end of this meeting, I was walking out with the assistant commissioner. He said, that is the most unbelievable meeting that I've ever been to. And as a side note, a couple of years later, I asked him about that, and he said, it's still beyond anything I've ever done. That was the most unbelievable meeting. So we blew ahead, and we moved, and it was a struggle. I'll tell you, it was a struggle. We had a union, and the union made it very, very difficult. I don't know how many Saturdays in a row that I would work because people would intentionally call out, and the house managers would call out, and so I would be working on a Saturday overnights and Saturday nights, and but it was the will to just keep going, to keep going, to keep going, to keep going. The union sued us, and we went to federal court. That they sued us for it, is they wanted the judge to decide that we have to recreate all the group homes, and everybody who moved out of shared living should move back into the group homes so that people could have their jobs. That never worked. But just to tell you sort of the difficulty and the unbelievable amount of commitment it took to face and to make sure that every family was taken care of. We did this one person by one person by one person. And well, we did it, and we moved out, and we by 1993 we were fully into shared living, and the organization, the organization made that sort of that transformation. By the time we had sort of moved through it, we really had decided there was really 5 components to shared living. The first one being the values, point 1 being the values, and everything else that we theoretically do at Nonotuck is based on our belief in life sharing. That is, that what we want to do is we want to be able to position people in ways that ultimately they may be able to have life sharing relationships. Whether or not it be at sort of at the most intimate level, where at some point people decide that we just want to live together without sort of, because we love each other, we respect each other, we're dependent on each other, and we don't want to silly this relationship with any monetary piece, so we're living in life sharing, and we don't want any other service. That's what we would hope that the ultimate goal would be for everybody else. But there are other types of life sharing relationships that we have, whether or not it be friends or associates or the people, that, at Cumberland Farms that we go in every day that they know what we're going to drink for our coffee or whatever. So it's our belief and our core belief in life sharing and what that will mean, what it means for us and what it means for disabled people is the number one sort of aspect of shared living. The second part is what we call the development piece of that, and that's when you really get to know who people are, people with disability, and then you create potential shared living providers out there, and you do this in extraordinarily deep, thoughtful ways, and then you make a match and you put people together. And the match really, when you think about it and you look at it, is what it's all about. I mean, shared living is one person in one situation, and we may do it 450 times in this organization, but it's really one person. And the match is what is the key. So it's really, as much time we can spend making sure that that match is right, then we can then believe in what that relationship and what that shared living circumstance is going to be. The third piece is the transition, which is once we've made the match, then we decide, and then we try to ensure that this list of things are done to ensure that people, when people move, that all people are sort of informed of what's ahead of them. The fourth piece is what we call the support and the monitoring piece, which is once people move in, we don't abandon them. What we have to do is we have to make a balance between supporting that relationship as well as monitoring the relationship. And then the final piece is the emergency, the safeguards piece, is which we have to be prepared for any emergency that may happen. So that's basically families. And then, so we were moving ahead, the agency began to grow. I mean, primarily it was in Western Massachusetts. You know, our home and our core was around the Northampton area, but we expanded in the Greenfield area, we expanded into the Springfield area, we became much more operationalized in the Berkshires, then we started to head east, and then we grew in central Mass, particularly in the Worcester area, and then the north central Mass we grew. And then as in 2006, as we began our FC program, then it really took off in the eastern part of the state. So in 2006, we were licensed to begin to provide AFC services. So over the course of the first several months, obviously, we didn't provide many services in AFC, but over 6 years, we now serve well over 300 people in AFC, and it's now more than half our budget comes from AFC than DDS. So we went from 0 to almost $9 million in AFC services. So it's pretty extraordinary. A lot of credit has to go to, most of the credit has to go to the kitty curtain around this. Basically, that's the story of Nonotuck. Now you're sort of a part of that story as we begin to sort of grow. There are so many exciting things that are going on here that when we think about what happens at the sort of the level of the relationships. I mean, I could go and talk to every one of you here and all the program directors, and just you think about what relationships that have been developed over these years. Cheryl talked about her 19-year relationship with John. We have and Kitty has had a 16-year relationship with Dan. I mean, it just goes on and on. Berkshires to Greenfield to South Hadley, this area, Springfield, North Central. So it begins with the relationships, these incredible relationships that we've been so fortunate to be part of. To sort of the development and the merging of the AFC with and the ability now to support people through sort of the nursing piece of it. When you really combine DDS and AFC services, you're getting just remarkable services in that. To the relationships that we have with our two sort of what I call sister organizations, HMEA and Alternatives, as well as sort of a third, which is Central South America in Worcester. That's continuing to develop, to the IT development, sort of the web development, and on and on. It's a pretty remarkable, I think, organization to work for. So that being said,